of the CIE specification for IGCSE, and this is from 2007, though the questions asked follow a very similar pattern in regard to the sensors and for this chapter. So this question 12 is about a chemical factory, so always look for the context of which the question is talking about and answer in relation to the context, very important. It asks, identify two different sensors used in this application. So give an example of how each sensor could be used in the chemical factory. So on this side of the screen you'll see you've got gas sensor, temperature, motion or infrared, pressure or pH, light. So any of those that you choose, you get 1 mark for, and then the use of it. So for example, it's a chemical factory, so we don't know what type of chemical, we don't know the details, but we can talk about obviously a temperature sensor. A thermometer as such will measure the temperature of the chemicals to make sure they're not too high. Pressure, perhaps about the pressure of the chemicals flowing through pipes, for example, and pH, of course, to make sure the acidity or alkalinity of the chemicals is correct. So hopefully that's fairly clear in terms of how to answer that section. Part B is seen several times over the past few years for this spec. It's a very formulaic answer, so you have to say essentially how are the sensors and microprocessor, how are they used to monitor this process. So number one, the sensors send a signal to the microprocessor. Of course, sensors are mostly going to be taking information about the real world via analog. Number two, the analog signals are converted to digital, so we're using an analog to digital converter. That's your second mark. Then the microprocessor compares the value to a stored value. And if it matches it, or it's within a range, then obviously it might send a signal to alert the workers, or send a signal to raise an alarm. Something might happen to that extent. Or it sends a signal to cool the process down, heat it up, add a chemical, anything that might be reasonably occurring in a sense of a chemical factory. Or maybe no action is taken because it's a value that's perhaps a temperature and pressure that's within the range. And then of course it might record those readings. So for each reading it takes, maybe that's 1 a second, maybe it's 10 a second, maybe it's 60 a second, whatever the frequency of the sensor readings, it may record those in a data file. Somehow, we don't need to know the details, we can abstract from that, or it might output them on the screen. So there's a visual indicator for a chart, a graph, something. And then finally, it loops back up to number one. Make sure you get the mark for saying, this is a control system. It's going back to the first number one, a bit like how an Arduino Uno works. When you write code on that, everything's within a loop. So you're going back to the start, and the sensor is then returning the signal to the microprocessor, and we go through that again and again. Like I said, maybe once, twice, 40 times, 8 times, however many times a second. That's question 12 of this paper. It's worth 9 marks, so it's a reasonable amount for the paper. If we go back up to the top of the paper, we can see, let's scroll to the top of the paper, you'll see that the marks for this paper are 75. So 9 marks is obviously well over 10% for a fairly straightforward answer. So that's chapter 6 of the Cambridge CIE specification.